The morning Georgia Covington buried her husband, the sky over Harlan Creek, Texas turned the color of a fresh bruise, and she told herself right then and there that she would not fall apart, not in front of the 14 people standing around that narrow grave with their hats pressed to their chests and their eyes full of pity she did not want. She was 31 years old. She had a boarding house, a mortgage on that boarding house that could swallow her whole if she let it, a vegetable garden that needed tending, a well that needed a new rope, and exactly $42.16 in the tin box she kept beneath the floorboard in the kitchen. She had no children because the Lord had not seen fit to give her any, and she had a husband named Earl Covington who had died of a fever that moved through him like a brush fire in 3 days flat, leaving her with all of the above and nothing else. So she squared her shoulders, thanked the people who came, nodded at the preacher, and walked back to the boarding house on Whitfield Street, and she opened the front door and she got to work. That was 1878. By 1885, the Covington boarding house was the finest establishment of its kind in Harlan Creek, which was not a large town by any measure, but had grown considerably since the railroad spur had been laid 2 years prior. It had 8 rooms, each one clean and well kept, with fresh linens that Georgia washed herself every Monday without fail. It had a dining room where she served breakfast at 6 in the morning and supper at 6 in the evening, and the food she put on that table was the sort of food that made grown men close their eyes when they took the first bite. She had a porch with a swing, a front garden with marigolds along the fence, and a reputation that stretched all the way to San Marcos. She ran it alone. She had for 7 years. There had been offers of help, of course. Her neighbor, Dottie Prentice, offered to send her eldest boy over to do heavy lifting whenever Georgia needed it. The preacher suggested on more than one occasion that a woman alone ought to consider remarrying, and he said this in the gentle, well-meaning way of a man who truly believed he was being helpful and could not understand why the woman he was speaking to kept looking at him with that particular expression. Various men in town had expressed interest over the years, some of them decent enough fellows, and Georgia had been polite to all of them, firm with most of them, and in one memorable case, pointed toward the door with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. She was not unfriendly. She was simply a woman who had learned the precise and particular weight of her own life, and she carried it without complaint. The rooms of the boarding house had seen all manner of people pass through. Traveling salesmen, cattle buyers, a circuit judge who stayed for 2 weeks and read scripture aloud at breakfast until Georgia asked him, with great gentleness, to perhaps do his reading in his room. A young schoolteacher named Miss Albright, who had been posted to Harlan Creek, and wept quietly into her supper for the first week before Georgia sat down across from her one evening and talked to her plainly about the particular loneliness of new beginnings. And after that, Miss Albright had dried her eyes and learned to love the town. A family of 4, traveling west, who had stayed 3 nights and left behind a rag doll that Georgia kept on the mantel because no one ever came back for it. Room 4 was the room at the end of the upstairs hallway. It had the best window in the house, facing east, so the morning light came in long and golden and lay itself across the floor like something belonging to a painting. It was slightly larger than the others, with a writing desk in the corner and a rocking chair beside the window, and Georgia had always felt, in some way she could not quite explain, that room 4 was waiting for something. It had never held a boarder for more than a few weeks. People would come, stay briefly, and move on. She had stopped wondering about it. That changed on a Thursday in September of 1885. Georgia was at the front desk, which was really just a wide table near the entrance where she kept the ledger and a tin cup of pencils, when she heard boots on the porch steps. Not the shuffling, hesitant step of a man unsure of his welcome, but a deliberate, even tread, the kind that belonged to a person who knew where they were going even if they did not know exactly what they would find when they got there. She looked up. The man in the doorway was tall, lean in the way that came from hard work and not from want, with dark hair that needed cutting and jaw stubble that suggested he had been traveling for several days. He wore trail-dusty clothes, a brown canvas coat and boots that had seen considerable country. He carried a saddle roll over one shoulder and a battered leather satchel in his other hand, and he held his hat in front of him with both thumbs hooked over the brim in a way that struck her, later, as the most honest thing she had seen in years, because it was neither servile nor arrogant. It was simply a man standing in a doorway, asking to be let in. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I heard you had rooms," he said. His voice was even and low, carrying a faint trace of somewhere north of Texas, maybe Missouri or Kansas, the kind of accent that had been worn down by years on the trail until only the shape of it remained. "I do," Georgia said. "How long are you looking for?" He considered this with the seriousness of a man who had learned not to make promises he could not keep. "Can't say for certain. Week, maybe 2. Depends on some business I have here." "It's $3 a week," she told him. "That includes breakfast and supper. I don't cook between meals. If you want to keep a horse, the livery stable is 2 blocks east, and Tom Aldrich there is fair. No drinking in the rooms, no loud company after 9 in the evening, and if you break anything you pay for it." He nodded slowly, as though each rule were a thing he was measuring and finding reasonable. "That's fair," he said. "I'll take a room." "I have one on the upper floor," she said. "Room 4, east-facing. It's the best I've got right now." "Room 4, he repeated, and there was something in the way he said it that she could not quite read, not amusement exactly, more like a quiet acknowledgement. "I'll take it." She turned the ledger toward him and set a pencil beside it. He set down his hat, picked up the pencil, and wrote his name in a clear, practiced hand. "Warren Sullivan." She read it and looked up at him. "Mr. Sullivan," she said. "Ma'am," he replied, picking up his hat again. She took the key from its hook and led him up the stairs, and she showed him the room, and she told him that the washroom was at the end of the hall and was shared between the 3 occupied rooms on this floor, and that breakfast was promptly at 6 and supper promptly at 6 in the evening, and if he missed either meal, he could find something in the kitchen provided he cleaned up after himself. She said all of this in her standard, border-settling voice, efficient and not unfriendly, and he listened to all of it without interrupting, which already put him ahead of a considerable number of men she had dealt with in her life. She left him to unpack, went back downstairs, and stood for a moment in the kitchen with her hands flat on the work table, looking out the window at the marigolds along the garden fence, and she told herself that there was absolutely nothing remarkable about Warren Sullivan except that he had good penmanship. She almost believed it. Supper that first evening was pork roast with gravy, boiled potatoes, and green beans from the garden, with a pan of cornbread on the side. There were 3 other boarders at the table that week: Mr. Hatcher, a cattle buyer from Abilene who talked constantly about cattle prices; old Mr. Fenwick, who was a retired postal worker and was very quiet and ate everything with tremendous focus; and a young man named Cecil Darby, who had come to town hoping to find work at the new feed and grain outfit, and had been staying for 9 days while the negotiation dragged on. Warren Sullivan came to supper in a clean shirt with his hair combed back, which was more effort than Cecil Darby usually made. He took the empty seat across from Mr. Hatcher, introduced himself briefly, and did not volunteer anything further about himself, which Georgia noticed from her position at the end of the table, where she sat each evening to ensure the meal went smoothly and to facilitate whatever conversation seemed to be required. Mr. Hatcher asked Warren what his business in Harlan Creek was. "Land," Warren said simply, and cut into his pork. Hatcher nodded with the satisfied air of a man who had received enough of an answer. "Plenty of it around here. You looking to buy or to survey?" "Looking," Warren said. Hatcher accepted this and moved on to his preferred topic of cattle futures. Warren ate his supper with evident appreciation but without making a production of it, and twice during the meal he looked up and found Georgia's gaze already on him, and both times she looked away first, which she noted with some irritation because she was not in the habit of being caught staring. After supper, the boarders went to their rooms or to the parlor, and Georgia cleared the table and washed the dishes. And when she carried the last of the bowls into the kitchen, she found Warren Sullivan standing at the kitchen door. "Mrs. Covington," he said, and she turned. He was holding his plate and his cup. "Can I bring these in?" She blinked. In 7 years of running this boarding house, not a single male boarder had offered to carry his own dishes to the kitchen. "You don't need to," she said. "I know I don't," he said. "Can I anyway?" She stepped back from the doorway to let him pass, and he set the plate and cup in the wash basin with the economy of a man used to cleaning up after himself in places where there was no one else to do it. And then he said, "That was the best supper I've had in a very long time, Mrs. Covington." "Thank you," and he left the kitchen without waiting for a response. Georgia stood very still for a moment, looking at the place where he had been, and then she finished the dishes. The business Warren Sullivan had in Harlan Creek was not what she had expected, though she was not entirely certain what she had expected. He went out each morning after breakfast, sometimes on foot and sometimes on his horse, a solid bay gelding he had stabled at Tom Aldrich's livery, and he came back in the evenings in time for supper, dusty from the road, and he was always prompt at both meals and quiet in between, and she would have called him the ideal boarder except that there was something about him that did not let her mind settle. On the third day, she found out from Dottie Prentice, who found out everything eventually, that Warren Sullivan was riding parcels of land east of town, and that he had been in conversation with the county land office. Dottie suggested, with the bright speculation of a woman who loved a mystery, that he was perhaps a land agent for one of the railroad companies, though Georgia thought this unlikely because land agents for railroad companies did not have the look of men who had been doing their own hard work for many years. On the fourth day, Georgia broke the 3-inch handle off the kitchen pump while trying to force it past a mineral buildup that had been giving her trouble for a week, and she was standing in the kitchen looking at the broken handle in her hand and calculating how much the repair was going to cost her when she heard a sound at the back door and looked up to find Warren Sullivan standing there, having come in through the garden. "Something break?" he asked. "The pump handle," she said, holding it up. He came inside without being invited, which under ordinary circumstances would have required a comment from her, but she was genuinely frustrated with the pump and did not have the energy for it at that moment. He looked at the pump, then at the handle, then crouched down to look at the base of the fixture. "Mineral buildup in the joint," he said. "I can fix this." "Mr. Sullivan," she said carefully, "you are not here to fix my pump." He stood up and looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated expression she was starting to recognize as simply the way his face worked. "I know that," he said, "but I can fix it. I spent 3 years working pump maintenance on a ranch in Kansas before I started doing land work. It'll take me about an hour. I've got the tools in my saddlebag." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she asked. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "Because it's broken and I can fix it," he said. She thought about arguing the point and decided against it. "I'll pay you for your time," she said. "You feed me twice a day," he said. "That's payment enough." He fixed the pump in 40 minutes. She made coffee and set it on the table without comment, and when he was done and washing his hands at the basin, he sat down across from her and drank the coffee, and she sat across from him with her own cup, and for a while neither of them said anything. "How long have you been running this place alone?" he asked. It was a direct question but not an intrusive one. She had heard the question in various forms many times, usually with an undercurrent of something that needed answering, whether she would consider help, whether she was lonely, whether she had thought about what a nice thing it would be to have someone to share the burden. His question had none of that. He asked it the way he had asked if he could carry his plate, simply curious. 7 years, she said. He nodded. "That's a long time." "It is," she said, "but the work is good work and the house is mine." He looked at her over the rim of his cup with an expression she could not precisely categorize. It was not pity. It was something closer to respect, maybe with something else underneath it that she did not examine too carefully. "What brought you to Harlan Creek?" she asked, and the question came out more genuinely curious than she had intended, less like the polite inquiry she used with all her boarders, and more like she actually wanted to know. He set the cup down and looked at the window, where the late afternoon light was coming in across the kitchen table. "I've been moving around for about 10 years, he said. "Different work, different places. Did some cowboy work when I was younger, then ranch management, then the land surveying. I'm 34 years old and I've been sleeping in bunkhouses and boarding houses and under the open sky for most of my adult life." He paused. "I want land of my own, a place I can put something into. There are good parcels east of here, better than I've seen in a long time. The soil is right, the water is right. I think this might be the place." She listened to all of this carefully. "What did you do?" she said, "before the cowboy work?" Something moved across his face, brief and contained. "Grew up in Missouri," he said. "My father had a farm. I left when I was 19 and didn't go back." She did not ask why. He had answered her question and drawn a line past it at the same time, and she understood that kind of line. "Well," she said, "I hope you find what you're looking for east of town." "So do I," he said, and he was looking at her again in that way that she was going to have to acknowledge at some point was not the way a boarder looked at his landlady. By the end of the first week, Warren Sullivan had become a fixed and comfortable presence in the rhythm of the boarding house in a way she would not have predicted. He was there at breakfast and at supper. He helped old Mr. Fenwick carry his trunk down the stairs when the old man checked out, and a new trunk up when Mrs. Harlow, a widow traveling to visit her daughter in El Paso, arrived and needed room 3. He sat on the porch some evenings with Cecil Darby, who had finally secured his position at the feed and grain and was in considerably better spirits, and they played cards sometimes, and Warren let Cecil win with the casual generosity of a man for whom it was not the winning that mattered. Georgia watched all of this from the corner of her awareness while continuing to go about her work with the same efficiency she had maintained for 7 years, and she told herself, firmly and regularly, that Warren Sullivan was a boarder who was passing through, and that the fact that his hands were kind and his eyes were honest, and he had fixed her kitchen pump, and asked for nothing in return was not a reason to feel anything particular. She had been perfectly fine for 7 years. On a Sunday evening in the 3rd week of his stay, there was a thunderstorm that rolled in off the plains with considerable drama and very little warning, and Georgia was on the porch trying to get the swing cushions inside before the rain came when the wind hit the porch railing with a crack, and the whole section gave way, because she had been meaning to repair that railing for the better part of a month and had not yet gotten to it. The cushions went off the porch into the garden, and Georgia stood for a moment in the rising wind, looking at the collapsed railing, and she laughed. Not the polite laugh she used in company, but the real one, the sort that came up from somewhere genuine and could not be helped, because sometimes the only reasonable response to a failing porch railing in the middle of a coming thunderstorm was to laugh. Warren came out the front door behind her with his jacket half on, probably heading to check on his horse at the livery, and stopped when he saw the railing. "What happened?" he said. "It gave up," Georgia said, which made him blink and then laugh too, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was the kind of laugh that matched the person, not performed, just real. They went inside, and the storm came in hard, and the lightning was the spectacular kind that lit up the whole flat country in white-blue flashes, and Georgia made tea and brought it to the parlor where a few of the boarders had gathered, drawn by the storm and the company, and Warren sat in the chair by the window and watched the rain come down the glass in sheets. Later, when the other boarders had gone to bed and the storm had eased to a steady, quiet rain, Georgia was sitting at the parlor table with her household ledger, doing the accounts, a task she performed every Sunday evening that she found both satisfying and faintly melancholy in the way of necessary things. She heard Warren in the doorway. "You keep good records," he said. She looked up. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms folded, looking at the ledger with an expression of straightforward curiosity. "You can't run a house without knowing where every dollar goes," she said. "No," he agreed. He came into the parlor and sat in the chair across the table, as naturally as though he had done it many times, and she was startled to find that she did not mind it. "My father never kept records," he said. "That was part of how we lost the farm." She looked at him. It was the first time he had offered anything unprompted about his past. "I'm sorry," she said. He shook his head slightly. "It was a long time ago. He wasn't a bad man, just not a practical one." He looked at the ledger again. "You are a very practical woman, Mrs. Covington." "I have had to be," she said. He looked up at her then, and there was something in the way he said what he said next that made her understand it was not a casual observation. "I know," he said quietly. "I can see it. 7 years is a long time to carry everything yourself." She held his gaze for a moment and felt something loosen in her chest, some small, careful knot that had been there so long she had stopped noticing it. "Some things you carry because there's no other way," she said. "I know that too," he said. The rain went on outside, soft and steady, and neither of them spoke for a little while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. "What's the business you have to sort out before you can buy the land?" she asked eventually. He looked at his hands. "Money," he said. "I've been saving for years. I have most of what I need. I'm waiting on a letter from a land broker in Austin who has a parcel I'm interested in east of town. If the price is what I think it is, I can manage it. If it's higher—" He paused. "I may need to work another season and come back." "You'd come back," she said. The question hung in the air for a beat longer than intended. He met her eyes. "Yes," he said, "I would come back." She looked at her ledger. "I see," she said, which was not a particularly adequate response, but was the only one available to her at that moment. The letter from the Austin land broker arrived 10 days later, on a Wednesday, and Georgia knew it had come because Warren was different at breakfast, more still, the way a person was when they were trying to contain something large. He read the letter in his room and came down to breakfast afterward and ate without mentioning it, and she did not ask. After breakfast, when the other boarders had gone about their mornings, she was clearing the table and he was still sitting with his coffee cup, and he said, "The price is fair." She set down the stack of plates she was holding. "Good," she said. "I'll be riding out tomorrow to look at the parcel properly," he said. "I'd like to make an offer by end of week if it looks right." "Good," she said again, and the word cost her something she chose not to examine. He rode out the next day, and he was gone all day, and Georgia went about her work, which she always did, and she scrubbed the upstairs hallway floor and fixed the hem on a curtain in room 2, and made a chicken stew that was about as good as chicken stew could be. And she did not think about Warren Sullivan more than every 15 minutes or so, which was only a minor improvement over the rate at which she had been thinking about him for the past 3 weeks. He came back that evening just before supper with mud on his boots, and a particular kind of quiet energy that Georgia, who had spent 7 years reading the moods of the men and women who passed through her house, recognized as contained elation. "It's good land," he said at supper, and old Mr. Fenwick's replacement, a talkative surveyor's assistant named Gus Petty, asked several enthusiastic questions about acreage and water rights, and Warren answered them all with careful precision, and Georgia listened while pretending to be focused on the cornbread. That night she sat on the porch after supper, because the evening was cool and clear, and the sky over the plains was full of stars in the dense, unobstructed way that only came when you were far enough from any real concentration of lamplight, which Harlan Creek still qualified as. She heard the door behind her and Warren came out and sat on the step, because the swing was at the other end of the porch and she was in the middle of it, and he leaned his back against the porch post and looked out at the same sky. "I'm going to make the offer," he said. "I know," she said. He turned to look at her. In the dark, with only the yellow glow from the parlor window behind her, she was aware that he was looking at her the way she had been not examining for 3.5 weeks. "Georgia," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name, and it did not startle her the way it should have. It settled instead, the way a thing settles when it finds the place it was meant to be. "Warren," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plain because I think you deserve plain speaking and I am not good at any other kind." "All right," she said. He looked at his hands. "When I rode out east of town today looking at that land, I kept thinking about this house, and about you, and I realized that what I've been doing for 10 years, moving from place to place, saving money, looking for the right piece of ground, it wasn't only about the land." He stopped, and the night was very quiet around them, just the distant sound of a horse somewhere on the next street and the small wind moving through the marigolds. "I don't know what you feel," he said. "I don't presume to know. But I know what I feel, and I think you should know it too, because I am going to be buying land 3 miles from your house, and if this is something entirely in one direction, it would be better to know it now." She looked at him for a long time. He met her gaze steadily, without pressure, waiting the way a man waited when he had said what he came to say and understood that the answer belonged to someone else. "I have been running this house alone for 7 years," she said carefully, "and I have been entirely comfortable with that fact for most of those 7 years. And then you came in through my front door, and you put your name in my ledger, and you fixed my pump, and you laughed at my broken porch railing in the middle of a thunderstorm, and somewhere between all of those things I stopped being entirely comfortable with the thought of you leaving." He looked at her for a long moment, and then that honest, unperformed smile moved across his face. "That's about the most practical declaration I've ever heard," he said. "I am a very practical woman," she reminded him. "You are," he said, "and you're considerably more than that." She felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the evening. "Don't say things you can't mean," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. "Georgia," he said, "I don't say things I can't mean. Ask anyone who's ever had to deal with me. It's something of a chronic condition." She laughed then, the real one again, and he looked at her like she was something worth looking at, and the stars over Harlan Creek went on in their indifferent and spectacular abundance. He made his offer on the land on Friday, and it was accepted by the following Monday. And in the intervening days, the quality of the air between Georgia and Warren Sullivan changed in the way that air changed when a door was opened, not all at once, but in a gradual, irreversible shift. He began lingering at breakfast a little longer when the other boarders had gone. She began finding reasons to be in the parlor in the evenings when he was sitting with his plans, and his surveyor's notes spread across the table. He would look up when she came in, and the look on his face was one she was learning to read like her own handwriting. On Tuesday evening, he took her to supper at the hotel dining room on Main Street, which was the only establishment in Harlan Creek where one could have what passed for a formal meal, and Georgia put on her dark blue dress, the good one, and pinned her hair up properly. And when she came downstairs, he was standing in the parlor in a clean coat, and he looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she was not certain she could fully describe, except that it did not leave room for any doubt about his feelings. "You look beautiful," he said, simply and without any decoration. She had not heard those words in a long time. She had not known, until she heard them again, how much she had missed them. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in multiple directions at once. The hotel dining room had white tablecloths and a young Mexican boy who poured water and pretended not to hear what people at the tables were saying. They had roasted beef and boiled carrots and a piece of cake that was too sweet, but they ate it anyway, and they talked for 2.5 hours, the kind of talking that started with practical things and kept deepening despite itself, the way a river widened as it went. She told him about Earl, about the early years of the marriage, the good parts, and about the last 3 years which had been less good, and about the morning he died and the $42 in the tin box, and she told it all plainly, without asking for anything in return, because it was the truth and it was part of her, and he was a person who deserved to know the truth. He told her about Missouri, about his father's temper and his mother's patience and the farm that had been in the family for 2 generations before the debt took it, about leaving at 19 with a horse and $30, and a determination never to be beholden to anyone or anything, about the years of cowboy work and the dust and the bunkhouse, and the loneliness that a person got used to the way you got used to a bad knee. It was always there. You just stopped expecting it not to be. "Did you ever think about going back?" she asked. "To Missouri?" He shook his head. "My father died in 1880. My mother had already passed. There wasn't anything to go back to." "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her across the white tablecloth. "I think everything that happened led me here," he said. "I'm not sorry about that." She looked at her hands. "That is a generous way to look at a hard life," she said. "What other way is there?" he said. She looked up at him and felt that loosening in her chest again, deeper this time, and she thought about 7 years of being a very practical woman, and she decided that being practical was still good and useful, and she intended to keep doing it, but that it did not have to mean being alone. The months that followed were the kind of months that a person looked back on later and understood to have been a particular quality of time. The kind where everything was changing, but was changing towards something rather than away from it. Warren completed the purchase of his land in October. It was 160 acres east of town, with good grass and a seasonal creek and soil that he spent considerable time on his hands and knees examining with an expression of concentrated joy. He began building slowly, with his own hands, and with occasional help from men he hired from town. A house first, small and sturdy, set on a rise so that the east-facing windows would get the morning light, which Georgia recognized when he described it to her as the same thing he had valued about room 4. He did not check out of room 4. Every evening he came back to the boarding house for supper, and afterward they sat on the porch or in the parlor, and the other boarders were diplomatic about their own company in the way that only happened when an entire household understood that something important was happening between two people. Cecil Darby, who had extended his stay considerably past his original few weeks because the feed and grain had become a real and good job, and he had become fond of the house, was openly and unself-consciously delighted about the whole situation, and made no effort to conceal it. Mr. Hatcher came and went as cattle prices and the season required, and on his last visit of the year he shook Warren's hand at breakfast and said, "You're a lucky man, Sullivan," in the tone of a man stating a mathematical fact. In November, Warren kissed her for the first time. They had been standing in the garden at dusk, in the last light, and she had been showing him where she planned to expand the vegetable beds in the spring, because the boarding house business had grown enough that she was feeding more people and needed more produce, and he was listening with his full attention, which was the way he listened to everything, and she said something about the quality of the soil along the south fence, and he said he could bring some of what he had been finding on his land. And she turned to tell him what an excellent idea that was, and he was right there, closer than she had realized, looking at her with that look she had learned to read, and she stopped talking. He lifted his hand and touched her cheek, very gently, with the back of his fingers, and then he kissed her, and it was unhurried and warm and entirely without uncertainty, the kiss of a man who had been sure of what he wanted for quite some time and was simply, finally, doing what he wanted. She kissed him back, which she noted was not in the least a practical decision, and which she did not regret in the slightest. They stood in the garden in the last of the November dusk for a little while, not speaking, and the marigolds had gone to seed, but the fence was still standing, and the sky was going orange and then purple over the plains, and she thought that she had not felt this way since she could barely remember when, and maybe not even then, because this was different from what she had known before. This was slower and more certain and more weighted with the knowledge of what it cost to lose a person and how much harder it was to let yourself want one again. "Georgia," he said quietly. "I know," she said, because she did. Winter came across the Texas plains with more bite than the previous year had offered, and Warren's construction on the East 40 slowed to what could be accomplished between cold snaps, which was not nothing, but was considerably less than he had hoped. He stayed in room 4 through December and into January, and Georgia told herself this was simply a practical arrangement because building stopped in the hardest weather. And it was. And it was also something else entirely, which she was honest enough to admit to herself in the evenings when she was alone in her room and the house was quiet. On Christmas morning, the boarding house was uncharacteristically full, because 2 families were passing through and had needed rooms, and Cecil Darby had invited his new friend from the feed and grain, a young man named Horace, and Georgia made a Christmas breakfast that was ambitious even by her standards, with eggs and salt pork and biscuits with gravy and dried apple preserves on the side, and the dining room was full and loud and warm with the wood stove going. And she stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment watching it, this house full of people and warmth and voices, and felt something she recognized as deep and uncomplicated gratitude. Warren found her there. He came to stand beside her in the doorway, close enough that his arm was against her shoulder, and he looked at the dining room too. "Merry Christmas," he said. "Merry Christmas," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small parcel wrapped in cloth. "I made something," he said, and his voice was slightly uncertain in a way it rarely was, the uncertainty of a person offering something personal and not entirely sure of its reception. She unwrapped it. Inside the cloth was a carved wooden box, small enough to fit in 2 hands, with a simple geometric pattern worked into the lid, clean and careful. She looked at it for a long time. "The wood is from the first tree I took down on my land," he said. "The big cottonwood along the creek. I didn't want to just burn the scraps." She ran her thumb along the pattern on the lid. "It's beautiful," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "I wanted to give you something that would last," he said, "something that came from the land." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that unguarded expression that still had the power to stop her breath. "Warren," she said. "I know this is not a conventional statement," he said carefully, "but you should know that I intend to marry you if you'll let me when the time is right and when I have a house worth bringing you to and when I can look you in the eye and say that I am not asking you to give up this house or this life, only to let me be part of it." She stared at him. "That," she said, "is the most thorough proposal I have never received." "I haven't asked yet," he said. "I'm telling you my intentions. There's a difference." She almost smiled. "Of course there is. When I ask," he said, "it will be properly, but I thought you should know the direction things are heading." She looked back at the dining room full of people eating her Christmas breakfast, and then at the wooden box in her hands, and then at Warren Sullivan standing in her kitchen doorway on Christmas morning looking at her like she was the fixed point he had been navigating toward for 10 years without knowing it. "I appreciate the advance notice," she said, and the smile was real and wide, and she did not try to contain it. January brought a development that was not on Georgia's list of anticipated winter events. A man named Calhoun Deems, who owned the dry goods store on the east end of Main Street and who had expressed interest in Georgia more than once over the years and had been politely rebuffed each time, came into the boarding house on a Tuesday morning with what he described as a business proposition. Georgia listened to his business proposition, which was that she sell the boarding house to him, as he was interested in expanding his properties, and that the price he was offering was reasonable. She listened to the whole thing and then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Deems. The boarding house is not for sale." He said that it might be worth her while to reconsider, given that running a large establishment alone was considerable work for a woman, and that he could offer her a fresh start. Georgia looked at him with an expression she had spent several years perfecting, which was not rude exactly, but which conveyed with great precision that the conversation was over. "I have been running this establishment alone for 7 years," she said. "I will continue to run it. I suggest you look elsewhere for your investment. Good morning." He left, and Georgia stood for a moment in the front room, looking at the ledger on the table and the key hooks on the wall and the particular quality of the winter light coming in through the front window. And she felt a clear and certain pride in what she had built here, in this house that was hers down to the last nail. She told Warren about it that evening on the porch, and she told it matter-of-factly because that was how she told most things. And when she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He'll not trouble you again." "He won't," she agreed, "because I told him not to." Warren smiled at that. "Yes," he said, "you did." And there was that respect in his voice again, the steady, uncondescending kind that she had not expected to find in a man and had found in him. Spring of 1886 came in green and bright and impatient, and construction on Warren's house east of town resumed with full vigor. He was out there most days now from before sunrise to after sunset, and he hired 2 men from town to help with the heavier work. And the house rose from the Texas ground in the earnest way of a structure that was being built to last. He took her to see it on an April afternoon, the 2 of them riding out on horseback in the clean spring air with the bluebonnets coming up in the grass along the road, and the sky the particular deep blue of a Texas spring day that made you feel like the world was new. The house was not finished yet. The walls were up and the roof was on, and the windows were in, but the inside was still rough lumber and sawdust, and the smell of fresh wood. It sat on its rise with a good wide porch and those east-facing windows, and the land stretched away from it in all directions, green and rolling and waiting. They stood in what would be the main room, sunlight coming through the window glass in long bars across the raw floor, and Warren stood beside her and looked at the space with the expression of a man who could see what it would be even in its current state. "What do you see when you look at it?" she asked. He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about things. "A kitchen with a real stove," he said. "A table big enough for people. A bedroom with that window looking east. A porch where a person could sit in the evening. Children running in that grass." He paused. "You," he said, "mostly you." She turned to look at him fully. He turned to look at her. "Warren Sullivan," she said quietly. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small ring, plain silver, worked into a simple band, the kind a silversmith in San Marcos made for people who wanted something real and lasting and without pretension. "I told you I would ask properly," he said. "Georgia Covington, you are the most practical, honest, remarkable woman I have ever known, and the last 7 months have been the best of my life, and I want to keep building this with you. I want to put in a kitchen stove with you and plant a garden with you and sit on that porch with you for as long as I live. Will you marry me?" She was crying, which she had not expected, because she was not generally a woman who cried, and she found that she did not particularly mind. "Yes," she said, and the word was immediate and certain and came from the same place as all the things she knew to be true. "Yes, I will." He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it there in the bar of April sunlight coming through the unfinished window, and she thought that it looked like it had always been there, like something returned. He kissed her there in the unfinished house on the rise of his land in the spring of 1886, with the bluebonnets visible through the open doorway and the sound of a meadowlark somewhere out in the grass, and she kissed him back with her whole self, without reservation, without the careful management she had applied to herself for so many years, and it was a different kind of freedom than any she had known before. They were married in June. The wedding was in the yard of the boarding house, because Georgia had said she wanted it there and nowhere else, and Warren had said that made perfect sense to him. Dottie Prentice organized most of the decorations, which Georgia allowed because Dottie needed to feel useful, and because the results were actually quite beautiful, with white ribbons on the porch rail and wildflowers in mason jars on the tables they set out in the yard. The preacher who had gently suggested Georgia remarry several times over the years presided over the ceremony with such evident satisfaction that Georgia forgave him all the previous suggestions. Cecil Darby stood up for Warren, grinning so broadly that Horace, seated in the front row, had to gesture at him twice to contain himself. Tom Aldrich from the livery came and brought his wife. The hotel owner's wife, Mrs. Carmichael, came and cried from the second row, though she and Georgia were only moderately well acquainted. About 40 people from town came altogether, which was nearly everyone Georgia dealt with regularly over 7 years. And the yard was full, and the food was the best food that had ever come out of that kitchen. And Georgia wore a cream-colored dress she had made herself with fabric from the dry goods store, and she had never in her life felt more herself. Warren stood at the front of the yard under the old elm tree and watched her come down the porch steps, and his face did the thing it always did when he looked at her, that open and uncomplicated and entirely unguarded expression, and she thought, this man, precisely. They said their vows in clear voices in the June sun, and when the preacher said the words that mattered, Warren looked at her with the absolute steadiness she had come to understand was simply his nature, and she said her own words back to him with the same steadiness that was simply hers, and the 40 people in the yard were very quiet. After the wedding, there was the practical matter of the boarding house. They had discussed it at length in the careful, honest way they discussed everything, and the decision they came to was this: Georgia would continue to run the boarding house. It was hers. She had built it, kept it, and made it what it was, and it was a good business and a good house, and there was no sense in setting it aside. Warren's land and house were 3 miles east of town, and he would continue building there and working toward getting his stock on the land, which was what he had saved and planned for. But they would not begin their marriage in a half-finished house, while leaving a perfectly good boarding house standing empty. They kept room for themselves on the nights when weather or work kept Warren from riding out to the East Land, and they arranged themselves into a life that was 2 lives in the process of becoming one, which was messier and more complicated and more alive than either of them managed alone. The house east of town was finished by August, and Georgia made curtains for those east-facing windows from a soft blue cotton she had been saving for some particular purpose without knowing what it was. And when she hung them in the finished bedroom and the morning light came through and turned the blue to gold at the edges, she stood very still and felt the particular, wordless rightness of a thing in its proper place. She kept her room at the boarding house too, the back room off the kitchen that had always been hers, and she was there most of the week, running the business that was still hers to run, and Warren was on the land most of the week, building the operation he had planned for years. But every evening they were together, sometimes at the boarding house and sometimes at the East Land, and on Sundays they sat on the wide porch of the new house and watched the light change across the grass. They had a dog that fall, a brown hound of uncertain lineage that wandered onto the east property during harvest and declined to leave, and they named him Aldrich, after Tom Aldrich, who had a similar personality. The dog became devoted to Georgia with a single-mindedness that Warren said was completely understandable and not at all surprising. Georgia hired a woman named Vera Cates that October, a widow in her 40s who had worked as a cook for a ranch operation out of Seguin and had come to Harlan Creek following her husband's death. Georgia recognized the particular competence and self-possession of a woman who had been managing things on her own, and she hired Vera at a fair wage to help with the cooking and the heavier laundry, and it changed the texture of the work considerably. Not lighter exactly, because the boarding house had more guests now than it had in years, but more sustainable. In the evenings when Georgia sat with the ledger now, Warren was often across the table from her with his own accounts, the land purchase notes, and the cost of fencing and the records of what he was planting in the south field. And the parlor was quiet and lamplit and domestic in the way she had not known it could be. And sometimes she would look up and catch him watching her with a small, private smile, and she would shake her head because that look still did to her heart what it had always done. By the spring of 1887, Georgia knew she was expecting. She told Warren on an evening in March, standing in the kitchen of the boarding house with the supper dishes done and the lamp burning low on the table, and she told him plainly, because plain speaking was what they had always done, and she watched his face while she said the words. He sat down very slowly in the kitchen chair. He looked at her. His eyes were bright in a way she had never quite seen before. "Georgia," he said. "I know," she said. He stood up again, crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and pulled her into his arms with a gentleness that had an entire world behind it, and she let herself be held, her cheek against his shoulder, and felt his hand come up to the back of her head, and they stood that way in the kitchen for a long time. "Are you well?" he said against her hair. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am slightly terrified." "So am I," he said. She laughed softly. "That is very unhelpful, Warren." "I know," he said. "We'll be terrified together. I've found that's better." She felt tears, which she acknowledged and allowed. "I had given up on this," she said quietly. "In the back of my mind, years ago, I had given this up." "I know," he said. "I'm glad it came back." The baby was born in November of 1887, a boy, healthy and loud, with Georgia's dark eyes, and a temperament that Vera Cates said reminded her strongly of Warren, meaning he was quiet when he was content and absolutely clear about his dissatisfaction when he was not. They named him James Earl Sullivan, the James for Warren's grandfather and the Earl for Georgia's first husband, because Georgia felt that was the right thing to honor what had been without pretending it had not been, and Warren agreed without hesitation, which was one of the things she loved about him. The first months with James were the most exhausted Georgia had ever been, which was saying something given the previous 7 years. But Warren was there with a steadiness and a practical competence in caring for the baby that surprised some people, and surprised Georgia not at all, because it was entirely consistent with who he was. He got up in the night when the baby cried. He carried James in the crook of his arm while working at the kitchen table. He sat with the baby on the porch of the East House on quiet afternoons, with Aldrich the dog at his feet and Georgia inside finally sleeping. And those afternoons were ones he would remember for the rest of his life. The boarding house kept running. Vera Cates had taken on significantly more responsibility and was managing much of the daily operation by the spring of 1888 with a competence and care that made Georgia feel, for the first time in 8 years, that it was not entirely dependent on her being there every hour. She supervised, she kept the ledger, she made the major decisions, but the daily turn of the house moved on in her absences without disaster, and this was both a practical relief and, she admitted to Warren one evening, a slight and irrational pang. "You built that," he said. "It runs because you built it right." "I know," she said. "I just wasn't ready for it to not need me every minute." He smiled at that. "It still needs you," he said. "It just doesn't need you every minute. That's what it looks like when you've done it right." She looked at him. "When did you become wise?" she said. "I've been around you for 2.5 years," he said. "Some of it was bound to take." By 1888 the East Land was properly producing. Warren had put cattle on the south acreage and planted a wheat crop that came in better than he had hoped, and the house was fully furnished and had a real kitchen stove and a table big enough for people, as he had said it would, and a garden that Georgia had planted along the south wall of the house with the same hands and the same care she had given to the boarding house marigolds. Cecil Darby and his friend Horace had become constants in their social landscape, showing up most Sunday afternoons with some reason or another that was really just the reason of being fond of the Sullivans and liking where they ended up. Cecil had by now worked his way into a partnership share of the feed and grain and was doing well, and he sat on the east porch with Warren and talked about enterprise and seed prices and the County Water Commission. And Georgia brought out coffee and sometimes cake and sat in the porch swing with James on her lap and listened to their voices and felt the world right where it was supposed to be. In the autumn of 1888, a development arose in town that Georgia had not anticipated. Calhoun Deems, who had not given up as easily as she had assumed, had gone and spoken to a banker in San Antonio, about acquiring the boarding house through some application of debt pressure. He seemed to believe he had available to him. He had found out, through means she did not care to know, that there remained a small outstanding debt on the original boarding house mortgage, a remnant of a refinancing Earl had done in the final year of his life that Georgia had been paying down carefully but had not yet cleared. Deems went to the bank with a proposal to purchase the debt and call it due. Georgia found out about this from Dottie Prentice on a Wednesday morning, and she went home and sat at her kitchen table with the ledger open and did the arithmetic 3 times to make sure she had it right. She told Warren that evening. He sat across from her at the boarding house kitchen table the way he had the night she had first showed him her ledger, and he looked at the numbers she laid out before him, and then he looked at her. "What do you need?" he said. "I need to pay off the rest of the debt before he can do anything with it," she said. "It's $420. I have $210 saved in the household account. I need the other $210 before the end of the month." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, she knew, but thinking through the mechanics. "I can get you $210, he said. She shook her head. "Warren, your money is in the land." "Our money," he said, "is in the land, which also happens to be mine to draw from if my wife needs to protect the house she built." She felt warmth and stubbornness in equal measure. "This is my business debt," she said. "Georgia," he said, with infinite patience and a firmness she had learned was not arguable when he used it in quite that tone, "we are married. Your house is my house. Your business is my concern. Not because it requires my management, because it emphatically does not, but because what threatens you is something I am going to help address. That is what married means." She was quiet for a moment. "That is an extremely reasonable position," she said. "I know," he said. "I do not enjoy being in debt to anyone," she said. "You are not in debt to me," he said. "We are partners." She looked at him. He looked back at her steadily, the way he always did, without pressure or performance, simply with the unmoving certainty of a man who meant what he said. "All right," she said. The debt was paid in full before the end of the month. Calhoun Deems found that his opportunity had evaporated, and he accepted this with visible displeasure and thereafter confined himself to the dry goods store and left Georgia Covington, or Georgia Sullivan, as she was now in the county records, entirely alone, which was all she had ever asked of him. The boarding house was hers, free and clear, and it would remain so. James learned to walk in the winter of 1888, which was a development that filled the East House with a kind of joyful chaos that Georgia had not known she was capable of producing, and which Warren met with a characteristic combination of patience and barely contained delight. The boy got into everything. He was particularly drawn to Warren's work things, his maps and survey tools and the compass he kept on the desk, and Warren would sit him in his lap and explain each one with the same focused seriousness he brought to everything, and James would gaze up at him with enormous dark eyes as though understanding every word. In the spring of 1889, Georgia discovered she was expecting again. This time she was less terrified and more simply astonished at the continuing generosity of a life she had once been quite resigned to running alone. She told Warren standing on the porch of the East House in the April evening with the bluebonnets in the grass and James asleep inside, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with the back of his hand, the same gesture he had made on the first night he told her what he felt, and he said, "This is a good life, Georgia." "It is," she said. "I didn't know it could be this good," he said. She looked out at the grass and the last of the evening light. "Neither did I," she said. The second baby arrived in November of 1889, a girl this time, smaller than James had been and quieter, with Warren's direct gray eyes and a disposition that Vera Cates described as watchful, meaning she took in everything around her with an intensity that was a little uncanny in a newborn. They named her Clara, after Warren's mother, and she was the kind of baby who made people stop and look at her, not because she cried or demanded anything, but because she had a quality of presence that was simply difficult to ignore. James was 2 years old and deeply suspicious of Clara for approximately 3 weeks, after which he transferred to her a proprietary older sibling affection that would define their relationship for the rest of their lives. By 1890, the Sullivan household east of Harlan Creek was a working farm and cattle operation, a boarding house on Whitfield Street that had been expanded by one additional room thanks to a renovation Warren completed that spring, and a family that had been assembled from two solitudes into something that was entirely its own. Georgia ran the boarding house 6 days a week, rode out to the East Land on Sundays, and managed the household accounts for both with the precision and competence that had always been among her defining qualities. Warren worked the land with the focused dedication of a man who understood that he was building something that would outlast him. And in the evenings, he came home to Georgia and James and Clara and Aldrich the dog and the lamplit kitchen, and the smell of whatever was on the stove. The year also brought a change in the wider world that they felt in Harlan Creek as a kind of distant pressure. The cattle drives that had sustained the Texas economy for 2 decades were winding down as the railroads made them less necessary, and the open-range era was ending as more land was fenced and settled. Men who had spent their lives as cowboys found themselves at the margins of a changing landscape, and some of them came through Harlan Creek looking for work or for a different kind of life altogether. One such man was a fellow named Orville Bates, who checked into the boarding house in March of 1890, and who Georgia recognized within his first 2 days as a man in the particular kind of trouble that came from being very good at one way of life that was no longer available to him. He was perhaps 50 years old, wiry and weathered, with the hands and posture of a man who had spent 30 years on horseback, and he sat at supper with the boarders and said very little and ate with the absent focus of a man whose thoughts were somewhere a long way away. Georgia watched him the way she watched all her boarders, with the attentive peripheral vision she had developed over years, and on his 4th evening she set a second cup of coffee on the table across from where he was sitting in the parlor and sat down and said, "Mr. Bates, what is it you can do besides cattle work?" He looked at her with the startled expression of a man who was not used to being seen. "Ma'am." "You know cattle work," she said. "What else do you know?" He thought about it genuinely as though the question surprised him into honesty. "Fences," he said. "I know fences, and I know horses better than most men living, and I know how to read weather and land, and I can run a crew." "My husband needs a foreman on the East Land," Georgia said. "Someone who knows cattle and horses and can read land. It's steady work, fair wages, and you'd have room and board included." Orville Bates stared at her for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because you need work and my husband needs help, and it seems like the obvious thing to do," Georgia said. She spoke to Warren that evening, and Warren rode into town the next day and spoke to Orville Bates for 2 hours over coffee at the hotel. And at the end of those 2 hours, Warren offered him the position, and Orville Bates accepted it and moved out to the East Land by the end of the week. He turned out to be, as Georgia had assessed from the parlor, exactly what Warren needed, a man of considerable practical knowledge and quiet efficiency who understood cattle operations in a way that came from 30 years of actual work, and the East Land flourished under the combined effort. Orville Bates stayed on the Sullivan land for the rest of his working years, and he became a fixture in their lives, the kind of person who was not family and not an employee, but something in between, the kind of person that a particular kind of life produced, and Georgia was glad she had sat down across from him that evening with a cup of coffee. The decades that followed the wild, changing years of the mid-1880s settled into a life that was full without being frantic and grounded without being dull. The boarding house on Whitfield Street grew in reputation and in size, with 2 more rooms added in 1893, and Vera Cates eventually became a genuine partner in the operation, her name going up on the sign alongside Georgia's in 1895, which Georgia proposed one morning over breakfast as simply the right thing to do since it had been that for years in practice. James Sullivan grew up between the boarding house in town and the farm east of it, equally comfortable in both, with his father's directness and his mother's practicality, and a nature that was genuinely, straightforwardly good, the kind of child who made adults feel that the world might be all right. He was 7 years old when he first rode with Warren to check the fencing on the south acreage, and he was 9 when he started helping Orville Bates with the morning rounds, and by 12, he knew the land the way Warren knew it, from the ground up. Clara grew up watchful and steady and sharp, with a gift for numbers that made Georgia's eyes bright with something that was part recognition and part the particular satisfaction of seeing a quality you valued carried forward. She sat at Georgia's elbow doing the boarding house accounts from the time she was 8 years old, following the columns with a finger and asking questions that were frequently very good ones. She also had, from her father, a quality of absolute honesty that was occasionally inconvenient in a child, but which Georgia had no intention of discouraging. In 1893, Georgia and Warren had a third child, a boy they named Samuel, who was built like Warren and had Georgia's laugh, and came into the world with such an evident desire to be wherever the action was that it became immediately clear he was going to be interesting to raise. He was the one who climbed the fence at 3 and got on Aldrich II, the hound who had replaced old Aldrich, and attempted to ride him across the yard. He was the one who somehow disassembled part of the kitchen stove at age 4 and could not adequately explain why. He was, as Warren said with an expression that was part exasperation and entirely love, a full-time endeavor. The boarding house on Whitfield Street celebrated its 20th year of operation in 1898, and Georgia stood on the front porch on a June morning, 20 years after she had squared her shoulders at Earl's grave and walked back to this house and gotten to work, and she looked at the marigolds along the fence and the whitewashed front and the new sign, Covington and Kate's boarding house. That she had insisted keep the Covington name because it was the name the house had always had, and the name under which it had made its reputation. Warren came up the porch steps behind her and stood beside her and looked at the street with the particular quality of presence that was still, after 13 years of marriage, the most comfortable thing she knew. 20 years, she said. Hell of a thing, he said, which from Warren was considerable expression. Don't swear, she said, out of habit and without real conviction. Forgive me, he said, which he said every time, and neither of them meant it. She turned to look at him. He was 47 now, with gray coming into his dark hair at the temples and the lines of a face that had spent years in the sun, and he was still the man who had come through that door in 1885 with trail dust on his coat and honest eyes, and every year she had known him she had found more to know. "What are you thinking?" he asked, which was a question he had always asked her, and which she appreciated because most people assumed they knew. "I am thinking," she said, "about a Thursday in September 13 years ago and a man with his hat in his hand standing in my doorway." He smiled, slow and real. "I remember that. I was very composed about it," she said. "You were," he agreed. "Took you almost a whole month to start looking at me in a way that gave me any hope." "I was being practical," she said. "Of course you were," he said. She laughed and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood on the porch of the boarding house in the June sun, and the street of Harlan Creek went about its morning business around them. James was away that summer, having gone to San Marcos to apprentice with a land surveyor, which surprised no one given the hours he had spent with his father's maps and instruments. And Clara was 17, and running a not insignificant portion of the boarding house, accounts with an efficiency that made Vera Cates shake her head in admiring bewilderment. And Samuel was 5 and currently contained in the back garden under Orville Bates's supervision, which was the only kind of supervision that reliably worked. That fall, on a Sunday evening in September, Georgia and Warren sat on the porch of the East House in the cooling dark. the same way they had sat on the boarding house porch 13 years ago when he had told her his feelings, and she had told him hers in the most practical declaration he had ever heard. The grass was dry and golden in the last of the season, and the sky was enormous and full, the way the Texas sky always was, and Aldrich II was asleep at their feet and the lamp was burning inside through the window. "I want to tell you something," Warren said. She turned to look at him. He had that expression, open and unguarded, the one that had never changed. "When I rode into Harlan Creek in 1885, he said, I had a very clear idea of what I was looking for. A piece of land, something permanent, somewhere I could put down roots. And I found the land, and it is good land, and I'm grateful for it." He paused. "But what I found that I was not looking for, what I could not have imagined I was looking for because I had not known it existed, was you." He looked at her steadily. "Georgia Covington Sullivan, you are the fixed point. You are the thing, everything else has moved around." She was looking at him in the lamplight coming through the window, and she felt the same thing she had felt on that first night on the porch. That loosening in her chest, deeper now because there was more behind it. 13 years of a life built together. 3 children and a dog and a farm and a boarding house and a porch swing, and a wooden box she kept on her dressing table in the East House bedroom with a ring inside it, and the most thorough proposal she had never received until she had. "Warren," she said, "I ran a boarding house alone for 7 years. I was good at it. I was proud of it. And I thought that was sufficient." She held his gaze. "I did not know that sufficient and whole were different things until you came and sat in my kitchen and fixed my pump and didn't ask for anything." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had done 1,000 times, and held it in both of his, and she looked at their hands together in the edge of the lamplight. "We are going to grow old on this porch," he said. "We are," she agreed. "And that suits you," he said, though he already knew. "More than anything I can think of," she said. The stars over Harlan Creek came out one by one, the way they always had, indifferent and spectacular, and the two of them sat together in the quiet dark. And the night was long and unhurried, and neither of them was alone. James came home from San Marcos in 1899, a fully certified surveyor and a young man of 21, with his father's quiet confidence and his mother's way of looking at a problem from every angle before speaking. He came home and walked the East Land with Warren in the early mornings, the two of them going over fence lines and water sources, and the expansion possibilities Warren had been turning over for years. And Georgia watched them from the porch of the East House with her coffee cup, and felt something she had no adequate word for. Clara, at 18, had already received 2 proposals of marriage, both of which she had considered carefully, discussed with Georgia with a frankness that Georgia found both touching and occasionally alarming, and declined. She was not, she told her mother, in any hurry to make a permanent decision about the rest of her life, and she had the accounts to look after, and she was thinking about whether she might want to study further, because there was a women's college in Austin that had opened up, and the idea of it interested her. Georgia thought about this and talked about it with Warren that evening and said, "I think we should let her go." Warren said, "I think we should let her go," at almost exactly the same moment, and they looked at each other and laughed. And Clara left for Austin in the autumn of 1900 with a trunk and a letter of credit and Georgia's practical advice on keeping her own accounts and Warren's advice on reading people, which was shorter and to the point. Samuel, who was 12 in 1900 and still the most energetic member of a household that included cattle and a dog, had settled into a focused obsession with horses that eclipsed even his previous phases of intense interest in other things. And Warren and Orville Bates between them channeled this into useful horsemanship with remarkable success. By 14, he could ride anything in the county that stood still long enough to be saddled. The boarding house on Whitfield Street in Harlan Creek entered the new century still going strong. The town had grown considerably since 1878 and was still growing, drawn by the railroad and the surrounding agricultural land, and there was always a need for a clean, well-run establishment where a traveler could find a decent room and an honest meal. Georgia was 54 in 1908, which she noted with mild private surprise because she did not feel 54. Or rather, she felt 54 in the body and somewhere considerably younger in everything else. Warren, at 57, was still working his land with the same methodical dedication he had brought to it at 34, though he was doing less of the heaviest work, and Orville Bates, still going strong at nearly 70, with the durability of a man who had spent his life outdoors, was doing more. James had taken on a full partnership in the Sullivan land operation by 1905, and was running much of it with the competence of a man who had grown up with it under his hands and in his blood. On a September morning in 1908, precisely 23 years after Warren Sullivan had walked through the front door of the boarding house with his hat in his hands, Georgia sat on the front porch of the East House in the early light. The marigolds she had planted along the fence were going orange and gold in the first cool days of the season. The east-facing windows of the bedroom threw their morning light across the floor inside, the same quality of light she had told him about when she first showed him room 4. Warren came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her, and handed her one, and she took it without looking up from the marigolds. 23 years since you walked into my boarding house, she said. Approximately, he said. Do you know what I thought when I first saw you, she said. You thought I had good penmanship, he said. She turned to look at him, startled, and then burst out laughing. How did you know that? You told me, he said, about 3 months after we were married. You said the first thing that struck you was the penmanship. I said no such thing, she said. You absolutely did, he said. I have been quietly amused about it ever since. She shook her head, still laughing, and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the morning light came across the porch and across the marigolds, and across 23 years of a life they had made together out of 2 separate solitudes and a Thursday in September. James arrived that morning with his wife, a clear-eyed young woman named Ruth who had grown up on a neighboring farm and who Georgia had liked immediately for her directness and her excellent sense of humor. And they had their son with them, a 2-year-old boy named Warren James Sullivan, who was currently attempting to follow Aldrich III, the current hound, across the yard at a pace that neither his legs nor the dog's patience could quite sustain. Clara was home for the fall visit, having completed her studies in Austin and taken a position with an accounting firm there, and she was at the kitchen table inside with the year-end boarding house accounts, going through them with Vera Cates and making suggestions that Vera was noting down in her careful hand. Samuel, now 20, was out at the barn with Orville Bates, discussing horse breeding in the focused way he always did when the subject was horses. Georgia sat on the porch with her coffee and Warren's arm around her, and watched her grandson chase the dog across the yard, and she thought about the woman she had been in 1878, standing at Earl's grave in the bruised sky, telling herself she would not fall apart. She had not fallen apart. She had built a house and kept it and run it and learned the precise weight of her own life and carried it without complaint, and she had done all of that alone, and she had been good at it. And then she had not been alone, and that was better, not because she had needed saving, because she had not. Not because she had been incomplete, because she had been whole, in the way a person could be whole and still find that wholeness expanded by another person who understood it and added to it rather than diminishing it. Warren had never asked her to be smaller. He had never suggested she manage less or want less or accomplish less. He had come into her life and fixed her pump and laughed at her broken railing and told her what he felt and then let her decide. And when she had decided, he had stood in an unfinished house on a spring afternoon and asked her plainly and properly and without ornamentation to share what he was building. Room 4 of the boarding house on Whitfield Street was still there, still had the east-facing window and the writing desk and the rocking chair. Vera Cates had kept it just as it was, which she had done partly out of habit and partly because Georgia had never explicitly told her to let it out, and it sat at the end of the upstairs hallway and looked out on the morning light, waiting, or perhaps not waiting anymore, because the person it had been waiting for had walked in and never walked out, and had built a house east of town with windows that caught the same light, and had given the particular quality of room for a larger and better expression. The man who had checked into room 4 in September of 1885 had, in every way that mattered, never checked out. Georgia looked at her grandson catching the dog at last and holding the animal with the triumphant joy of a 2-year-old who has accomplished the thing he set out to accomplish, and she looked at Warren beside her, and she looked at the marigolds in their September gold, and she felt the morning settle around her like something she had earned and been given both at once, which was the truest way she knew to describe a good life. "What are you thinking?" Warren asked. She looked at him. "I am thinking," she said, "that room 4 had good taste." He was quiet for a moment, and then he laughed, the real one, and she leaned into him, and the morning went on around them in its ordinary and extraordinary way, and there was no question left unanswered, no thread left loose, nothing unresolved in the wide and settled country of their life together. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.